India has been talking about women's reservation in parliament for almost 3 decades. That's 30 years. Governments changed, prime ministers changed, coalitions rose and collapsed, but one thing somehow stayed exactly the same. Women make up only around 15% of the Lok Sabha, which is far below the global average. Now, here's what makes this strange. This is not an issue where political parties disagree publicly. Almost every major political party in India says it supports women's reservation. So the obvious question becomes, if everybody supports it, why has it still not happened? Because somewhere along the way, women's reservation stopped being just a gender issue and has actually become a political survival issue. The first formal women's reservation bill was introduced in 1996, then again in 1998, again in 1999, again in 2008. Every few years, the bill returns like a ghost. It is debated, celebrated, declared historic, and then it is delayed over and over again. Which is why the story is not really about whether India supports women's representation. It's about what happens to political power when representation actually changes. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Every major party supports the idea. Congress supports it, BJP supports it, regional parties publicly support it. So, who exactly is blocking it? The uncomfortable answer is almost everyone, because supporting a reform in theory and surviving that reform politically are two very different things. The real debate is no longer should women get representation. The real debate is who loses power when women get representation and under what arrangement. Because political systems do not resist change randomly, they resist changes that redistribute power. And women's reservation would do exactly that. This is one of the least openly discussed parts of the debate, the seat loss problem. Under reservation, constituencies rotate, meaning a constituency that was open earlier could suddenly become reserved for women in the next election cycle. Now think about what that means politically. An MP may spend 20 years building influence in one constituency. He builds networks, workers, funds pipelines, gathers voter loyalty, influences local power structures, and then one notification changes everything. Suddenly, a male politician cannot contest from the reserved constituency anymore. Their political career can effectively collapse overnight. Every sitting male MP, regardless of ideology, has a personal reason to resist or delay implementation. Maybe they won't say this publicly, but that resistance is very much real. Politics in India is deeply territorial. Constituencies are not just electoral zones, they are ecosystems of patronage, loyalty, caste negotiation, and long term visibility. For many politicians, losing a constituency is not just about losing an election, it is about losing relevance itself. And that fear cuts across party lines. This is why a bill that sounds morally straightforward becomes politically explosive the moment implementation talks become real. This is a strange thing about Indian politics. The loudest battles are not always the real battles. Publicly, almost everyone praises women's empowerment, but privately, the incentives are completely different. Because reservation changes who gets tickets, who gets seats, who gets visibility, who gets succession, who inherits political dynasties. And systems that are built around entrenched power do not easily surrender space voluntarily. Now we arrive at the most important layer of this entire story. In 2023, Parliament passed the Women's Reservation Bill. It made headlines everywhere. There were celebrations and victory speeches, but then came the condition. The reservation would only come into effect after delimitation, which means the bill was passed, but implementation was postponed into an uncertain future. And suddenly, women's reservation became tied to something much larger than gender representation. It got mixed up with India's demographic and federal tensions. Article 334A says reservation will only begin after a delimitation exercise based on the first census conducted after the Act. Now, delimitation is one of the most sensitive issues in Indian politics. And once reservation gets linked to delimitation, the entire debate explodes into something far bigger. The 2021 census was postponed during COVID, which made sense initially, but even by 2023, it had still not happened. So now the implementation of women's reservation depends on a future census, followed by delimitation, followed by constituency restructuring, which means nobody actually knows when reservation will begin. So critics began asking, did Parliament pass a historic reform or simply defer it? Delimitation means redrawing parliamentary constituencies based on population changes, and that creates a huge political problem. Because states with higher population growth gain more seats, and states with lower population growth risk losing influence. Now look at India carefully. Northern states generally saw higher population growth. Southern states controlled population growth more successfully, which means delimitation could shift parliamentary power northward. And now suddenly, women's reservation has become entangled with regional political anxieties. Southern states argue something very simple. They say, we implemented family planning successfully, so why should we lose parliamentary influence because of it? And honestly, from their perspective, this is not an irrational fear because representation in parliament translates directly into political bargaining power. It gives politicians budgetary influence, cabinet leverage, national visibility. So now the reservation debate is no longer just about women. It's also about North versus South. It's about federal balance. It's about population politics. It's about representation anxiety. This is why opposition parties began demanding something specific: implement women's reservation immediately without linking it to delimitation. In other words, don't attach women's political representation to a completely separate constitutional conflict. Because once the two becomes bundled together, implementation enters a political quicksand. And then comes the next layer: caste politics. Several region and social justice parties raised an old concern. If there is no OBC quota within women's reservation, who exactly benefits? Because without internal caste carve outs, many fear the seats would disproportionately go to upper caste women with greater social and political access. And that transforms the conversation again. Now the debate is no longer should women get representation, it becomes which women get representation. This demand has existed since the 1990s, and it reflects a larger reality about Indian politics. No reform in India remains a single issue reform for long. Eventually, everything intersects with caste or region or class or language or federalism or electoral arithmetic. So even a gender reform becomes layered with social justice debates, and once that happens, consensus becomes far harder. At this point, the original moral clarity disappears completely because now every side claims justice. Some argue women deserve representation immediately. Others argue representation without caste equity reduces privilege. Others fear regional power loss through delimitation. Others fear constituency displacement. And all of these concerns collide inside the same bill. This is why the issue has remained unresolved for nearly 30 years. Not because nobody supports it, but because everybody supports it differently. And this is the final shape of the trap. Women's reservation became tied to seat loss fears, census delays, North-South tensions, delimitation battles, caste equations, party survival instincts. Every political actor supports one part and fears another part, which creates paralysis. A reform everybody praises publicly, but nobody wants implemented under politically unfavorable conditions. Indian women are already one of the most important voting blocs in the country. Political parties aggressively court women voters. They are given freebies, they are made a part of welfare schemes. We see targeted outreach and symbolic messaging. But being electorally valuable is not the same as sharing governing power. Because voters influence politics periodically. Power blocks shape politics continuously. And that transition is far, far more disruptive. What makes this even more fascinating is that India has already tested women's reservation extensively at the local level. In panchayats and municipal bodies, in local governance structures, millions of women have already entered politics through reservations there. And despite early skepticism, the system has survived. In many places, women leaders reshaped governance priorities entirely, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. National politics is not delaying reservation because the experiment has failed. Maybe it is delaying it because the experiment worked. So the real question is no longer whether India supports women's reservation. Officially, everybody does. The real question is this: what happens to Indian political power when women stop being treated primarily as voters and start becoming a governing bloc? Because that would not simply change representation. It would change negotiation itself. It would change the debates around candidate selection, party hierarchies, regional power, dynastic succession, coalition structures, and perhaps that is why this bill has remained trapped for nearly 3 decades.